Before we get started, I want to tell you folks that our friends at Trenchworks, who are the guys that have made all of our minis up until now, are running their own crowdfunder for some MCDM hobgoblins and some goblins and some other cool stuff. I very strongly encourage you to check this out. I am super excited because I think these are just the best hobgoblin minis I have ever seen, and I am dying to use them in my game. Hobgoblins and Draw Steel are really cool, and I think Dusk Book 2 is going to feature a lot more hobgoblins. So if you're like me and you want really dope hobgoblin minis, hie thee hence to BackerKit and check out Trenchworks' new crowdfunder. On with the show. No idea if this is going to be a short video or not. Let's find out together. So as I think you folks know by now, or you should know, one of my major interests in life is the origins and history of D&D. I love that 70s era where this relatively small group of people just invented the future. They created an entirely new way of gaming, a whole new hobby. I love that DIY sense of it. They had no blueprint to follow, no idea what they were doing. Some of them had some experience as game designers, but that was for war games and they were mostly amateurs. None of them knew, how do you make an RPG? Which makes sense because they didn't know they were making an RPG. That label didn't get stuck onto this new thing for years. So much of what we today celebrate and criticize, they were just improvising on the spot. Hey, I got this cool pack of plastic toys from the 7-Eleven down the street. We could use these as monsters. 50 years later, people still play with these toys in one sense or another. Well, if you're like me, and you are, do I have a book for you? This is The Elusive Shift by John Peterson. John is sort of the unofficial, official biographer of Dungeons & Dragons. He's written several books. I've read all of them. I especially love The Making of Dungeons & Dragons, which has incredible stuff in it. Like, you can read the fictionalized diplomacy results from the Middle-earth diplomacy game they all played before working on D&D. Sauron writing about the setbacks he faced on his western flank, but not to fear, reinforcements are coming. It's just an amazing look into the minds and games that influenced 1974 D&D. His other books can be pretty academic, the kind of stuff you would expect to get from a university press, and they're all in different ways about the early history of the hobby, where it came from. Like, if you're interested in the business side of TSR in the 1970s, you should read The Game Wizards, which details the origin of the company TSR, from its inception to the point at which it imploded, and all the mistakes they made. I told our general manager he should read it when he started here. He did, and he was properly educated. He said, they thought they were a game company, but they didn't sell games. They sold books, and they couldn't make books. They had to pay a printer to make the books. So whenever there was a problem, and there were a ton of problems, their only solution was print more book. Well, once you're borrowing the money you need to print the books you need to sell to pay off the debt you accumulated, getting to the point where you need to borrow more money to print more books, it's over. It might take a few years for the plane to auger in, but even if you briefly recover, there will be some other crisis, and eventually you'll have to pay the piper, but there's no money in the kitty. I heard a lot of received wisdom about why TSR went bust. Growing up in game stores in the 80s and 90s, it was super common for the guy behind the counter, always a guy, to waste your time at checkout regaling you with his favorite conspiracy theories about the hobby. So I love John's books because they are incredibly well researched and sourced. There may be other points of view not represented in his books, but there is none of the folklore, none of the conspiracy theories. You get the straight dope, often from contemporaneous records, the things people wrote at the time, sometimes literal receipts. All of John's books are good, but The Elusive Shift might be the most interesting book I have ever read because it's about that time in the 70s where D&D was new. No one knew what kind of game it was or how it was supposed to be played or what kind of game it could be. And folks just fumbled around making it up as they went. So that's what this video is about. Hey everybody, Matt Colville here. This video is about what I learned reading The Elusive Shift, and holy crap, I learned some amazing things. This book completely changed how I think about the 70s and what those folks were doing. I put it in the same category as the best documentaries I've watched, where I came out thinking, wow, whatever I thought I knew about that time and place, I didn't know shit. Really, this should be a whole series of videos, but I ain't got time for that, and it would be diminishing returns anyway, so we're just going to talk about some of the notes I took when I read the book and we're going to talk about some of the book's themes. The first thing I want to talk about is just how John collected his data. He wanted to know, how did people in the 70s think about D&D? What kind of game did they think they were playing, and how did that idea evolve over time? When they argued, what did they argue about? What was it like at the table for these folks? So as far as I can tell, and I should just ask him to come on the show and interview him, as far as I can tell, the dude just went out and got a bunch of old zines from the 1970s like this. Zine is short for, obviously, magazine, but they're also called Amateur Press Association zines, or an APA. Amateur meaning, well, what it says, but specifically it means we do not edit the articles people send us, because that costs money. So if they liked your article, they just printed it. And association just means like a group. So there was APAL for Los Angeles, the Amateur Press Association of Los Angeles, for nerds, specifically sci-fi nerds, to talk about their hobby. These are handmade, staple-bound pamphlets, basically, with really amateur art or no art. But some of the art is really good, and some fanzine artists matriculated up to the big leagues. Fanzines are where fandom happened in the 1970s. Gaming conventions came out of fanzines. Star Trek fandom, which is sort of the fandom, lived in magazines like this. Before social media, before the internet, before Usenet, there were fanzines, and people just made them on their own. They didn't ask for permission or wait for a publisher. They worked in a school or an office that had a mimeograph machine, or even, in the late 70s, a photocopier. They were typed out, like on a typewriter, and then maybe there's some layout where you get an X-Acto knife and some glue, and you cut and glue the articles and art together, but mostly it was just typewriter to mimeo machine, and you run as many copies as you have subscribers, and then you mail them out in the actual mail. A friend of mine in the 80s had his own punk or really like alt-rock fanzine in high school. I had no idea anyone could do such a thing. I was amazed. He was just 15, making his own fanzine and distributing it through local music stores. I was not around for 70s fandom. I already had a modem, and I was calling into bulletin boards before I was playing D&D. But you would be surprised how popular and robust these things were. One very popular form of fanzine was the letter zine. No articles, just people writing letters responding to other people's letters. Literally what social media is, but in 1974. Instead of posting and receiving replies in real time, you have to wait at least many days and probably a few weeks to get a single response. Does that sound like a pain in the ass? Well, the people in the 1970s probably didn't think so, because that was the speed their world moved at. They were mostly delighted to find like-minded nerds to talk to. So as soon as there was gaming zines, but they were all about different war games. There were also science fiction fanzines, and since a lot of those early D&D players were also science fiction nerds, the sci-fi zines got swamped with more and more D&D content, and so you got new, original D&D zines. That's how Alarums and Excursions got started. APAL in Los Angeles got tired of all these D&D letters, and so Lee Gold started a new zine just for D&D and games like it. And I think it's still going. Tons of ideas we think of as core to D&D happened in Alarums and Excursions first. Lee Gold should be more well-known to people in the hobby. She's one of the most important people in the early history of the hobby because of Alarums and Excursions. I tell you all this because, we're like 8 minutes into this and I haven't even really gotten started. I tell you this because this is basically what the Elusive Shift is. It is a survey of dozens of different zines going back before the introduction of D&D in 1974. So you get to read what the original D&D players thought this game was, what it could be, how it was played, how it should be played, how it should not be played. It is maybe the most interesting book I've ever read, but that says as much about the kinds of things I'm interested in as it does the book itself. I have no idea how John did this. Most of these zines are not archived online, and while you can get tons of them on eBay, you can't get all of them whenever you want. If you're looking for Different Worlds 3, because you have a copy of Different Worlds 4, and someone in there responded to some article from issue 3, and you have no idea what that article said, but holy shit, the response is super interesting, and you want to read the original? You just gotta hope it shows up on eBay. I made a ton of highlights as I read through this book. I'm not gonna read all of them because this video would be 4 hours long, but also I don't wanna spoil it. The first highlight I made, and I could have highlighted this entire book, but the first highlight I made was from chapter 2 titled How to Play. I'm gonna read a page of this and you'll know which part I highlighted. Fundamentally, how were you supposed to play the original Dungeons and Dragons? What form did the participation of players take? The text, published in 1974, gives us no shortage of rules. With imposing pages of charts and exposition, the books illustrate how to generate characters and underworlds and how to dice against tables to derive random encounters, decide random results, and disperse hard-won plunder. But they provide strikingly little instruction on how to integrate those activities into the moment-to-moment play of a game. In a traditional board wargame, say, players take turns. A rulebook for the game would explain how turns break down into phases of unit movement and combat. Some games specify that a turn represents a specific interval of game time, which in strategic wargames might be months. Each diplomacy turn represents half a year. But in tactical wargames can equate to minutes or just a few seconds. But the D&D rules do not instruct players to take turns. The game retains the word turn, but defines it solely as a measure of time for deriving movement rates and similar calculations relevant to a tactical situation. In the absence of turn sequences, and without the familiar constraints of boards and pieces, it was not at all obvious from poring through the books what the participants in a D&D game actually were supposed to do. As Ted Johnstone put it at the dawn of the hobby, quote, "It requires comprehension of lots of scattered elements throughout the rules to begin to get even a vague idea of how the D&D game is structured." Ted Johnstone was writing in APAL issue number 511 in 1974, and it's funny because I didn't know it when I highlighted it, but this is one of the major themes of the book. That original game in 1974 was incomplete. The folks who designed it were using chainmail for combat, outdoor survival from Avalon Hill, and almost no one outside Wisconsin had those products. So whatever you and your friends did with this cool new game, there's a good chance you might be the only people anywhere playing D&D that way. We still live with this weirdness. Everybody basically plays Catan the same. People use house rules. That's not what I'm talking about. I mean, people understand how Catan is meant to be played. It is unambiguous. But people did not understand how D&D was meant to be played. And reading this book, I think that's still true. That's why, or one reason why, zines were so important. No one writing about Star Trek in Spockanalia ever argued about how to watch an episode of the show. Well, you wait until an episode comes on, and then you sit down and you watch it. But people had to basically invent their own answers to the question, how do you actually play D&D? And this is important, people didn't realize they were all coming up with different answers. They made characters, the characters fought monsters and got loot. And so when you read other people's descriptions of their home game, it sounds like the same thing you and your friends are doing, but it was not the same, as we will see. Well, the core, what we would call gameplay loop as perceived by players in the 70s, was the statement of intention. We still have this. It is still basically how RPGs are played. The director explains the scenario. You state what you intend to do. This was not new or unique to RPGs. It's a big part of what this book is about. War games had a statement of intention because they were not originally played head to head. We talked about this a million years ago in another video, but people played war games with two sides and a referee or a judge. So the judge says, your scouts come back and report Napoleon's Second Army is right over the next hill. What do you do? Just like a dungeon master. And that was the 1950s. That is how war games were played. And that's why I've always thought of role-playing as a kind of war game, but not like Warhammer wargaming, the real wargaming from the 50s and 60s. I'm going to read a big chunk of this book, so strap in. But all the excerpts I read in this book is still less than like 1% of the book. So I'm not really spoiling anything. This is really just a teaser. This is the next chunk I highlighted, and it is about that notion of the statement of intention. That moment where you tell the dungeon master, or they would have called them a referee or the judge back then, what your character was going to do and how those statements were supposed to be interpreted. D&D inherited something of this didactic responsibility from the war games it imitated. Designing a dungeon has a certain kinship to designing a classroom test, in the sense that Kevin Slimlak surely meant when he said that, quote, a dungeon designer sets the problems for his adventurers, and they try to solve them, end quote. An adversarial teacher can always devise an unfair test that students will surely fail, and similarly, some referees take pride in devising tests they know more than half of their players will flunk. The D&D guidance on dungeon design cautions, quote, There is no question that a player character could easily be killed by falling into a pit 30 feet deep or into a shallow pit filled with poisonous spikes, and this is quite undesirable in most instances. Advice that the designer of Tomb of Horrors might well have heeded. That is a bit of shade Sean Peterson is throwing on Gary Gygax, because the person he's quoting when he said there's no question that a player character could easily be killed by falling into a pit 30 feet deep, and this is quite undesirable in most instances, he is the author of Tomb of Horrors. The rules instead recommend specifying, quote, as many mystifying and dangerous areas as is consistent with a reasonable chance for survival. Just as a teacher amenable to the edification of students will design tests that challenge pupils, yet still provide opportunities for the worthy to excel. Because D&D transpires in a conversation, assessing a player's worthiness hinges on statements of intention. Figuring out what to say and how to say it is fundamentally the measure of a player's skill. A canny referee handles a statement of intention based on what the player states, rather than what a player might have tacitly intended. Nothing better exemplifies this adversarial fidelity to player statements in D&D than the treatment of wishes. A magical wish presents players with a rare opportunity to share in the referee's world-shaping authority, but wishes also have a proverbial tendency to backfire. The wish rules in D&D place the entire burden for articulating the intended outcome on the player, clearly directing the referee to exploit ambiguities in a wish's wording so that, quote, a wish could be fulfilled without benefit to the one wishing. Reading this blew my mind. Basically, what this section is telling us is the classic way of doing wishes, where the players wish and the DM tries to screw them by twisting their words, is sort of how the entire game was played in 1974. Your statement of intent wasn't a magic wish, so you weren't getting screwed all the time, but referees were constantly arguing in these zines about whether they should respond to what you meant versus what you said. Many of them developed this theory that being good at D&D was being good at telling the director what you intended to do in clear, unambiguous language. If you believe that, then yeah, you punish players who are vague or make a lot of assumptions. If this sounds implausible, if you're thinking people didn't really play that way, I am here to tell you, as a player from the 80s, which is, strictly speaking, after the era this book covers, there were lots of directors who would be dicks about, well, you didn't say you were checking for traps in this specific space, so you fall into a pit. I remember as a teenager with my little proto-game designer brain thinking, how exactly are you supposed to play this? I was detecting the tension between the fact that the dungeon, a classic dungeon, was very dangerous and you were supposed to be careful and clever. But you could not actually see or interact with it. Instead, you could see and interact with the Doritos and the graph paper and LED minis and the CD changer remote. Everything was described to you by the director. So how exactly were you supposed to surprise players with a piece of wall they didn't think to check, when they literally cannot see the wall? It was like you were playing an escape room, but you couldn't go into the room. You had to send other people in and tell them what to do, and then they would come out angry that you didn't tell them to look in the potted plant. And you're like, what potted plant? Directors wanted these gotcha moments because they wanted to challenge and surprise players. But inevitably, the players would just say, we are meticulously searching every surface. And the director would get exasperated because to them, that took the fun out of it and it felt like poor sportsmanship. Are you really going to waste hours and hours searching every surface? Yeah, because we just say, we do it, and then you tell us what happens. I think literally thousands of groups of players all had this exact same experience. Years after the game came out, people were still wrestling with this fundamental disconnect. That kind of play, well, you didn't say you were checking the underside of every chair in the room. That might seem super unfun, but first of all, they obviously were having fun, or they were getting some value out of it, otherwise we would not be here now. But one of the things John points out is that RPGs descended from war games. And the original war games were military training aids. The referees in the Kriegspiel often screwed the players by deliberately misinterpreting their orders because they were trying to teach cadets the value of writing unambiguous orders. These weren't gamers, these were actual Prussian generals using war games to teach students. I found that whole thread just fascinating, how the wish behavior is like this last vestige of an entirely different style of play. It goes all the way back to the 1800s. But also, I think leaving that "you failed to give clear orders, you are a bad officer" style of play behind, which we have almost completely done, is the act of leaving the dungeon as the core gameplay experience behind and focusing on telling stories and fighting monsters and being heroes. I think that's the reason the game isn't about dungeons anymore, because you always ended up fighting with the dungeon master about this stuff. Are you bored? Well, good, because that is maybe the least interesting thing in here. Moving on. Here we get further into the "how do you actually play this game" question. Listen to this. Early adopters of D&D treated player participation in die rolls as a matter of referee discretion. Quote, "Some dungeon master types prefer to do all the die rolling, providing a narrative for the players," George Phillies observed early in 1976. When Sherna Burley first played with Lee Gold around that time, she informed Gold afterwards that her own dungeon was, quote, "going to adopt your practice of letting the players roll their own attacks, etc., dice. It was fun for me as a player to do it, and I bet it will be more fun for me as a DM not to have to do it." This is incredible. There was a huge debate that lasted years about whether the players should be allowed to roll. There was a major debate for months about whether the players should even know the rules. One side argued, no, that ruins the fun. The whole point is it's immersive. The game was supposed to live solely in your imagination. The other side argued, basically, that's insane. How are you supposed to run your character if you don't even know what you can do? And the funny thing is, to me, when challenged on this, the people who believed the players should roll their own dice just said, it's more fun. Other people were arguing very strongly that the players shouldn't know their characters can't hit the werewolf even with a natural 20. The players just hear, "you miss," from the DM, and they have no idea how they rolled. They have to deal with that ambiguity. Am I missing every round because the DM is rolling badly? Or is this because the creature's AC is literally so high I cannot hit even with a natural 20? You don't know. So what are you going to do? The thing about this is each group just assumed they were doing it the right way, and they were blown away when they would read these zines and learn that other groups didn't play that way. What do you mean you don't let players roll? Astonishingly, unlike a lot of the debates in this book, this one actually resolved before the end of the decade and everybody just started rolling dice. It was more fun, and the folks who didn't think the players should even know the rules lost. It's tempting to say the old guard lost the fight, but the actual point is there was no old guard. People were playing both ways from the very beginning. I think the reason the players should not know the rules faction lost was because they placed too much power and control in the hands of the director. One guy, writing in Alarums and Excursions, gave the example of the same encounter faced by two different groups. One group knows the rules of the game and rolls their own dice. The other knows only what the director tells them. Because the encounter is a bunch of were-tigers, one's wearing a collar, granting an armor bonus, one group is facing a hard but beatable encounter. The other is facing an impossible challenge because they do not have enough information to understand how difficult the encounter is, and there was no way to get that information. In other words, depriving players of access to the rules makes it harder for them to succeed. This is one of those moments where people reading the zines all went, oh. You'd read a report of people playing D&D in a zine and they're having a blast, but you try the game out and you have a miserable experience because your director didn't share the rules with you and you never got to roll any dice and you didn't have fun. But reading about the game in a zine, you didn't know that's not how everybody plays. As the game takes off with nerds, people find themselves naturally talking about what their characters did in the first person. I did this, we did that, we killed this ferocious dragon. When it was their turn, they quickly transitioned from my wizard creeps forward and looks carefully around the corner to I creep forward and look carefully around the corner. This led to players speaking in the first person about their characters all the time, and the game suddenly seems a lot more like one we would recognize. But this was hugely controversial, and it would remain controversial for years. Lee Gold, usually on the right side of history, wrote in Alarums and Excursions number 14 that she forbid people from speaking in character and required all interaction to be in the third person. Zagborg the Persnickety creeps around the corner. This caused other people in other zines, like Mike Chalinskas, to write, how do you play a character in the third person? Well, that's a good question, Mike. But then in the tradition of all great internet discussion and YouTube comments, he adds, this seems impossible, so it must be a bad idea. Right? One person is saying, this is how we play, and it's working for us. So someone else has to say, that cannot work. Not, that doesn't sound fun, or I don't think I would like playing in your game, but it is impossible to play like that. Even though it self-evidently is not impossible. A major part of this book is just laughing your ass off at how much the conversation in zines doesn't just sound like the way people argue online today. Many of them were arguing about the same things, because we still argue about this. I know it doesn't seem like it, but this issue about you playing a game versus your character playing the game still has its tendrils in modern play. People still argue about whether it's fair or whether it makes sense for you to be the person who solves a riddle or a puzzle in a dungeon rather than your character. We saw it in the Chain of Acheron. We had one episode that was just a series of riddles and puzzles, and it was a ton of fun. The players loved it. But folks in the comments and in various discussions online objected to the idea of players solving the puzzles because they argued your character might not be smart enough. Puzzles and riddles challenge the player, not the character. You see what I mean about we still don't know or really agree about how to play this game. Now, me, personally, I think this is ridiculous. The entire game is about challenging the players, not the characters, because the players make the characters. Even a monster combat is about my encounter design versus the choices you made in character creation and then the tactics you use in combat. But for those 70s players, and still some people today, this was a major issue. This led to one of the most mind-blowing things I read in this book. This was the point at which I started taking notes and highlighting stuff because I knew I was going to make a video about this. Little prelude. By this time, the question of playing a character versus playing a game had turned into a major issue across these zines. Players wrote in with extreme loathing about the idea that somebody might play their character as stupid if they had a very low intelligence score. For a lot of players, D&D was basically competitive. Us versus the dungeon. Just like war games were my army versus the director's scenario. And if you didn't show up ready to play optimally, that meant you were a bad player. A bad sport. People had long, well-reasoned arguments about, I do not want my character to get killed because you decided your character was too stupid to check for traps. Right? When you see it from their point of view, I mean, I'd feel the same way. But other players felt like playing a character, getting into character, speaking in character, was just 1,000 times more fun and unique. The people playing in character could explore a dungeon and have a ton of fun, but the people who required all players to play optimally because otherwise the dungeon would win couldn't roleplay. Roleplay was the opposite of how they played. And this led to very different flavors of D&D. Both used dungeons, but the Never Roleplay Ever group tried to make their dungeons as deadly as possible. The dungeon, getting loot, powering up, the reward of becoming more powerful, the power fantasy, was the entire game to those folks. And if you showed up with a low dexterity character and you did something clumsy on purpose because it's what your character would do, you would get kicked out of the group. The other group saw role-playing as its own reward. They liked leveling up, but they felt that power fantasy, playing only to get more loot and level up, was sort of juvenile. To them, the point was playing a character in a fantasy adventure. And the other way of playing? They called it the Gilded Hole. Over time, the narrative players won. People do not principally play D&D as multiplayer hardcore Diablo, the way some folks did in the 1970s. But that leads to this mind blower of a quote. This is someone trying to reconcile the two groups. This is another major theme of the discussion in zines. People trying to find ways to reconcile various different ways of playing. You're going to hear me reference the names of the various authors of these articles. Roos responded by proposing a definition of role-playing game with exactly that property. Quote, I define a role-playing game as one in which the participants assume a character and act within that role. He underlined the word role to emphasize the constraints that acting within it would imply. Roos, however, reinterpreted character abilities to avoid the excesses that frustrated Slimlack. Quote, I do not believe that the intelligence or wisdom characteristics are actually intelligence or wisdom, he argued. Magic ability and piety, or talent, and godliness would be more appropriate as names for the capacities of a character that D&D modeled with its intelligence and wisdom stats. This was the point at which I knew I had to make a video about this. Holy crap. These days, having a high intelligence in D&D means a lot of things, including you are more likely to know things based on how the skill system works. But in the 70s, there were no skills. In 1974, the rules said intelligence was the prime stat for wizards, and it determined how many languages you got. And that's it. No reference to anything else. No reference to how int might affect how many spells you know. As far as I could tell, there were no rules in 1974 for how you learned or cast spells. There were dozens of spells in the rules, no advice given as to how learning or casting spells worked. Remember the dude who said it is basically impossible to play these rules? Yeah, people had to invent their own rules for things like taking turns and initiative and how you learned a spell or how your spellbook worked. If you haven't actually read 1974 D&D, it is not what you think. It is not a D&D. It's not even 1976 D&D. It's not a game. In fact, given that it was published as 3 little staple-bound pamphlets, it was basically a zine. Anyway, why, this dude was asking, why play a character with low intelligence as stupid? The rules don't say that. All the rules say is intelligent is important for magic users, and it tells you how many languages you know. In other words, don't worry about playing your character dumb if they have a low int, because the game doesn't say that a low int means anything. My God, I wish everybody could read this book. Steve Perrin, the dude who invented RuneQuest, wrote in Alarums and Excursions about how his group played, causing Glenn Blacko to freak the fuck out. I'm going to read you Glenn's response, and you may not realize it, but you know who Glenn Blacko was. You folks are going to love this. Glenn Blacko practically sputtered in outrage when responding to Perrin. Quote, "This is remarkably depressing, and I hope I'm mistaking you, but it looks like you're saying that instead of rolling 3d6 for characteristics and trying to get the character type from them, you simply decide, oh, I want a monk, and you roll a d20 to see how good a monk you got?" Blacko summed up his feelings about this variant with a single word entirely in uppercase, verboten. Perrin confirmed that there was no misunderstanding. There is no use in having exotic character types if it takes forever to get one. The idea, good people, is to have fun. Playing a dud can have its own joys, but I prefer for them to balance out. I'm worried people are going to take the wrong lessons from this video. The point isn't, haha, how silly they were, and that obviously it's better to let people make their own characters rather than roll randomly. The point is, people did not know how to play. There was no right way to play because 1974 D&D was not a game. It was a framework onto which you had to impose your own rules. Glenn Blacko kind of comes off like a wanker in his letter, but he took the problem, it seems like we're not all playing the same game, and seriously tried to fix it. Not by changing how people play, but by changing how they talked about the game. He developed a language for communicating what kind of game you ran as a director or what kind of player you were. And that is how you know Glenn Blacko. He's the dude who came up with the list of different kinds of players in my old video, Different Kinds of Players. Robin identified 7 different types of gamers based on an earlier list by a dude named Glenn Blacko. Glenn's list appeared in an article for a magazine called Different Worlds, published by Chaosium, that launched a lot of people's careers back in the 80s. Wow! It was amazing to read this book and see folks whose names would, to me at least, become legend, appearing in zines talking about their own house rules that would eventually become their own games. Greg Stafford, Steve Perrin, Greg Kostikian. There's a quote from somebody in the 70s talking about how the Dungeon Master is fundamentally doing the same thing the players are, except instead of playing a character, they are playing a world. I love that. It's brilliant. There's a quote that almost knocked me over where this dude, who had been one of the early proponents of the Gilded Hole style of play, reveals a couple years later that he feels like he has the most fun when his character is really a collaboration between him and the director. He had gone from being a pure power gamer to discovering what a narrative game could do, and he couldn't go back. There's a whole section at the end, sort of depressing, where basically my generation enters the hobby on the back of the AD&D hardcovers and the basic box set, and how my generation were totally alien to the culture of the hobby. And the old guard talked a lot about how exactly to absorb us into the culture. One dude is running his dungeon at a convention, and all his players are kids. Like, the oldest was 14, And he freaks out a little. This is somebody in his late 20s or early 30s. All his players are his age. Everyone in the zines talking about this is the same age. And now he's at a con with a bunch of kids. And he realizes, hang on, my dungeon has some X-rated bits in it. Like, classic pulp fantasy nonsense with a bunch of Lamia who try to seduce the heroes. Genesis writes a song about this. Nobody bats an eye. But you put that same scene in your dungeon and you're at a con with teenagers, and not like 17-year-olds, like 13-year-olds. And suddenly you realize the hobby has changed, man. The dude sort of panicked as he realized he was about to sort of teach these kids about these concepts for the first time. He thought he was just a guy running a game at a con, but now he had to be an adult and act responsibly. So he did his best, and his solution was pretty good. No spoilers, read it for yourself. But the only reason I, and now you, even know this happened is he wrote about it in a zine. In the end, the old culture died. It could not be preserved against the onslaught of teenagers from the 80s. Basically, we live in the eternal September of gaming. There's an amazing section, which was a revelation to me, about AD&D and Gary's desire to make a complete RPG. And by his definition, complete meant there were no unanswered questions that might require someone else to fill in the blanks. This was part of the war between Gary and the zines. At first, he loved zines. People were talking about his game. But then people in these zines started to get really critical of D&D, which is fair because 1974 D&D is literally not a game. So each zine started to create, it's not fair to call them house rules, they were the rules. Remember when I said people had to invent their own answers to the question, how do you play this game? Well, this is the Arduin Grimoire. 3 little brown booklets, just like 1974 D&D, and you can see how this is smaller than a zine. This is sort of where my generation shows up. Remember Brad's brother Matt? The Earth Elemental Steps on Your Head? He had a copy of the Arduin Grimoire. He used some of these rules. Arduin was just one example of how people took the framework of 1974 D&D and made their own games. And you will note, well, the first thing you will note is how tiny the text is. Jesus. But the second thing is the first page with the header, How to Play the Game. Now, I don't know, if you asked David Hargrave, the author, what game he meant, how would he answer? Would he say D&D or Arduin or just a fantasy game? But let's see how Dave thought you were supposed to play. Keep in mind, Arduin was hugely popular, famous. I knew about it like 10 years after it came out. I've printed out so that my eyes can see it. How to play the game. Again, you folks are going to love this. It seems that most new players are uncertain as to the sequence of play in a fantasy game, so here is a rundown of most play situations. You see what I mean about how you can learn how they were playing by what they wrote. He is responding to the fact that people writing into these zines were all arguing about the fact that they didn't really know how to play. Overland travel. If the route is off marked primary or secondary roads, it goes like this. Move for 1 hour, then roll to see if you encounter random monsters. Then move for an hour and repeat the roll for random monsters. During daylight, there should only be 1 chance in 6 of meeting monsters, unless you're in the woods, marshes, or jungle, in which case it is 2 chances in 6. At night, however, all chances are doubled. At any rate, if a monster is encountered, then the sequence of events goes as follows. Determine the distance between you and the monster, from 20 to 240 feet in open terrain, from 10 to 110 feet in semi-covered or hilly terrain, from 10 to 60 feet in thick forest or other vision-restricted terrain, and always halved at night. Then determine who can see it and who can't, simple line of sight, and then determine the monster's reaction to seeing you. Roll a 12-sided die. Using this scale of reactions, a roll of 1 to 3, monster is frightened off. Roll of 4 to 6, and the monster shies back a bit and appears hesitant and nervous. Roll of 7 to 9, and the monster warily approaches the party. And a roll of 10 to 12, the monster launches itself in a screaming attack on your party without regard to its own safety. For intelligent foes, the table is roll 1 to 4 and they flee, roll 5 to 8 and they indecisively stand around and debate on what to do, and of course, a 9 to 12 is an unhesitating attack upon the party. Once that the distance of the monster and its initial reactions are determined, then it goes like this. How to play the game, folks. If the monster is charging and he is less than 30 feet away, this constitutes a surprise attack, and your party may not react until the monster has completed his movement and attack. Thereafter, it is a very simple matter of the fastest dexterity acting first, and the next fastest next, and so on down the line. This is covered more completely in the section on combat, but a short description would be all attacks are made, all movement is made, and then the process repeats itself. Because it is the dexterity that determines what attacks go first, it quite frequently happens that a warrior will strike his opponent just before it is struck in turn by a blast of magic, and his weapon is caught in the effects or he himself is. Such is the stuff melees are made of. After the battle is over and all the healing that is possible is done, then the movement process is repeated until the night camp is made. In other words, that is how they thought you played D&D. You go through the wilderness for an hour, roll to see if there's a random encounter. If there is, resolve it. And then that's it. That's the whole game. That's the whole game, he thought. It is also recommended that guards be posted at night and with the party's mounts when they are down in dungeons, because a good umpire will always hit you when you least expect it. Expeditions inside dungeons are just the same, only it is always dark, so bring your own light. This is 1977. D&D comes out in 1974. Can you imagine struggling with the rules, reading zines, trying to figure out how do you play this? And then you get Arduin and you're like, oh. But also, by 1977, it absolutely was not obvious that this is how you played. Lots of people had been playing for years at this point, and they would say, that's not how we play. In fact, I predict you will see a lot of comments about this video online that amount to, well, that's not how we played back then, which is the point of the book. People arguing online now about how the game was played in the 70s is just the same argument going on for 50 years. And those people do not know it. They think their way is the way. But there was no consensus on how you were supposed to play this game, and they argued about that all the way back in 1974. The Arduin Grimoire is just one example of how people took 1974 D&D and filled in all the blanks themselves. These were essentially competing games. Although to us today, they might all seem like different house rules for D&D, they are not. They are not house rules for a game. They took this framework and they made a game out of it. Well, Gary resented this idea. He felt like people were making money off the back of his work, and so AD&D was an attempt to close the loop, so to speak. The reason AD&D has so many insanely detailed rules about everything you can imagine, the random harlot table, the potion miscability table, the magical properties of gemstones, how to cure lycanthropy, is because Gary wanted to make a game with no space left for any competing future products like the Arduin Grimoire. And that is interesting to me for 3 reasons. First, I cannot imagine a game that needed more house ruling than AD&D. But those were actual house rules, as in, this rule doesn't make sense, here's a better rule. Stuff like the Perrin Conventions, Arduin Grimoire, the Necronomicon, not the Necronomicon, the Necronomicon, that was the 70s. After AD&D, people basically stopped with the alternate rules and they either made new games or just actual house rules. Second, it's interesting to me because it basically worked. The release of AD&D and the flood of new teenagers into the hobby meant the 70s were officially dead. That era, where you had to be a game designer to play D&D, was over. And with it went what I consider an age of miracles. That DIY, outsider art movement where thousands of nerds just created whole games in order to play D&D. Like I said in another video, when I look at those old 70s maps, I don't see dungeons and wilderness and continents. I see works of art. Outsider art, meaning these people had no training, they were aware of no trends or techniques in the larger world, they were creating purely for themselves and their nerd friends. Finally, it is interesting to me because this explains everything about why AD&D was so weird. I remember reading the Dungeon Master's Guide when I was a teenager, and I could not imagine how these people played. What kind of game was Gary running where all of these rules came up? I remember thinking they must have been playing this for like 30 years. Well, as it turns out, no. AD&D was not the result of collecting 30 years of rules and rulings. Gary made most of it up for the book. That's why the rules were so junky, and everyone was house ruling it in the 80s. Gary wanted to shut down these competing games by turning 1974 D&D into a game, which, by the definition at the time, meant a rule for everything. In other words, AD&D is Gary's version of the Arduin Grimoire. There's a chunk somewhere where somebody says, hey, I don't think Gary Gygax actually ever used these rules. And someone else writes in, this is from the Elusive Shift, somebody writing into a zine in the 70s. They write in and they say they attended a lecture by Gary where he admitted he never bothered with the rules and he would just roll dice because it made the players think he was doing something. Is that what players mean when they say old school play? There's also a delightful moment where David Hargrave, the author of the Arduin Grimoire, writes in a zine that everybody is writing in complaining about his new rules without actually having played them. And I was like, oh, my brother, welcome to the hobby. I could talk for hours about this book. I highlighted dozens of bits, but I really want to save the best stuff for you to discover. Specifically, I am not going to go into the conclusion the book reaches because it is way better for you to get there on your own. Essentially, the whole book is making a point. Peterson is slowly building an argument and proving each point as he goes so that by the time you get to the end, well, I'll just say it completely changed how I view not only the early years of the hobby, but also the present. About the kinds of arguments people get into and why we will always argue about this stuff. As long as people know what D&D is, they are going to argue about this stuff. You know, every hobby has people arguing, is it ethical to buy Behringer clones? Kirk versus Picard. But the people in those hobbies are all talking about the same thing. Whereas the arguments we've been having for 50 years amount to, what is this game? And how do you play it? I said in another video, we can't really talk about this game online. We talk past each other. If you have two groups, both using the same rules, but one is a director and 2 players and the other is a director and 6 players, they are playing 2 different games because their needs are so different. A game where the players are all war gamers and another where the players are all theater nerds, same rules, but they are playing different games. But when they go online to talk about it, they don't know they're all playing different games, so everybody argues all the time. There was a time in the late 70s where guys like Glenn Blacko tried to solve this and basically succeeded. And then AD&D came along and literally millions of teenagers, and that window closed forever. Before we go, I want to read you a chunk from one of the zines quoted in the Elusive Shift. This is Different Worlds. It's not really a zine. It's more what they would have called a prozine. It's not a real magazine like Time magazine, but not strictly amateur either. Different Worlds was hugely influential and gets quoted all the time in the Elusive Shift. Here is the section that I loved. So this is from an article titled Role-Playing, How to Do It, an Immodest Proposal by Clint Bigstone. It is 4 or 5 pages long. And here at step 3, we have playing a character whose sex differs from yours. When you take this step, and it's a big one, don't go it alone. Talk to your spouse, lover, sibling, parent, friend, etc. about what it's like to be of their sex. Ask how they react to common situations, remarks, conflicts, etc. Find out what are those common circumstances for them. For those of you who are straight or gay, take the same steps with regard to communicating with your gay or straight friends and relatives. That way, not only do you know how to play your character, you also get to spend a little time, a few steps maybe, in another person's moccasins. Whatever you do in playing any type of character, do not rely on stereotypes, not even from comedy, for your models. They are seldom accurate and almost always demeaning. 1979, folks. This just felt so, compared to how we now, looking back, view those people and how they played, this seems like really good advice. Very progressive, very forward thinking. He's basically saying, imagine other people complexly. If you really did this, people would look at you weird, but it is perfectly normal behavior for a writer. Writers do stuff like this all the time. What's it like to be a cop? What's it like to be a teacher? What's it like to be gay in this society? Yeah, if I asked any of my gay friends, hey, what's it like to be gay? I would get a look. But if I asked the right person, someone who, we trusted each other, I would still get the look and some variation of fuck off. But eventually, a really interesting conversation would happen. I do think those writer instincts where you go through life basically interrogating everyone and building a catalog of people and experiences are also really good instincts for role-playing, and they knew this back in the 1970s. That's it, folks. Thanks for watching. If you read The Elusive Shift, John Peterson, Jon, I strongly encourage you to come by our Discord, link in the doobly-doo, and post your thoughts. There are tons of people there who've already read it, and the discussion is super interesting. Also, finally, before we go, don't forget that there is a crowdfunder being run. I mean, it might strictly speaking be over by the time you see this video, but you can pre-order some dope hobgoblin miniatures and some goblin miniatures and some extra goodies, including maybe a certain pact of a metal that might be iron and it has a color. I don't remember what it was, but it might be black. Miniatures for those folks in this crowdfunder. We love the folks at Trenchworks. Their miniatures are awesome, and I am personally looking forward to using these in our game. As is tradition at the after a running the game video, or whatever this was, we will stream here on YouTube this Saturday at 11 a.m. Pacific, and we'll go over a couple of these old zines, and you can see for yourself. They are amazing artifacts of gaming history. Until next time, folks, peace out.